Chapter 12. Perfectionism and Social Anxiety. The nature of social anxiety. If you've ever felt uncomfortable in the presence of another person or nervous about making a negative impression on other people, you've experienced social anxiety. Most people experience anxiety or fear in certain social situations, at least some of the time. Perhaps you have felt uneasy in a situation where you were the center of attention, for example, getting married, acting in a play, or giving a formal presentation at work. Or perhaps you have felt uneasy at a big job interview or meeting your partner's parents for the first time. Like any situation that triggers anxiety and fear, social situations can be uncomfortable when they are perceived as threatening or dangerous in some way. In other words, you're more likely to be anxious when you believe that you have something to lose if you say the wrong thing, behave inappropriately, or seem uncomfortable. Social anxiety exists on a continuum. Some people may appear to never experience anxiety in any social situations, whereas other people avoid all social contact, including going to work and spending time with their family. Most people are in between these two extremes. You may be tempted to avoid social situations that make you uncomfortable. If you don't avoid these situations, you may rely on certain coping strategies to help get you through the situation. For example, a client seen in our clinic was a university professor who had an extreme fear of public speaking, including teaching her classes. Although she was unable to avoid teaching, she found subtle ways to get through her classes. For example, she always taught her students in the dark, using overhead transparencies so they wouldn't notice her anxiety symptoms. Also, she always wore turtleneck sweaters so that the blushing on her neck wouldn't be visible. Most social situations that trigger anxiety can be categorized into two main types: performance situations and social interaction situations. Performance situations are situations in which you are likely to be observed while performing some task. Social interaction situations involve speaking or interacting with another person. Here are some examples of each. Performance situations that sometimes trigger anxiety. Public speaking, for instance, formal presentations. Participating in meetings at work, answering questions in class, and so on. Singing, acting, dancing, or reading aloud. Using a public restroom with someone else in the room. Doing aerobics or playing sports. Riding with other people watching. Eating or drinking with other people watching. Going out in public without dressing nicely. Being sexually intimate. Social interaction situations that sometimes trigger anxiety. Going to parties, especially when the other guests are strangers. Being introduced to new people. Talking with people in positions of authority, for example, a boss or teacher. Being assertive. Initiating casual conversations. Maintaining casual conversations. Going out on a date. Going to job interviews. Sharing private details about your life with another person. Talking on the telephone. Confronting another person about a problem. In anxiety-provoking social situations, people are typically apprehensive about two different aspects of the situation. First, they have anxiety-provoking thoughts about the situation itself. For example, they may worry that others will find them to be incompetent, unattractive, unintelligent, or boring, despite the fact that they are actually unlikely to be judged negatively in the situation. Second, they have anxiety-provoking thoughts about looking nervous in front of other people. For example, they may worry that other people will notice specific anxiety symptoms, for instance, shaky hands or a sweaty forehead. People who are socially anxious often see their anxiety as a sign of weakness and take great pains to make sure that other people don't notice the symptoms. Because people who are socially anxious often avoid social situations, they may lack certain skills to perform well in these situations. For example, a person who is uncomfortable talking to other people may lack certain conversational skills that others take for granted. For example, how to make appropriate eye contact, how to ask questions of the other person, and so on. Similarly, people who completely avoid sports or dancing are unlikely to be extremely accomplished at either of these activities until they have opportunities to practice and develop their skills. Like other emotional states, social anxiety may be thought of as having three main components: the physical, the cognitive, and the behavioral. The physical component includes all the physical symptoms that people experience when anxious, including racing heart, irregular breathing, dizziness, shaking, sweating, blushing, or an unsteady voice. The cognitive component includes the beliefs, interpretations, and predictions that contribute to the anxiety. For instance, this person will think I'm an idiot. This component also includes a tendency to pay too much attention to information that confirms the anxiety-provoking beliefs. For example, if you are nervous while giving a presentation, you are more likely to notice the people in the audience who seem bored or unhappy than the people who seem interested in your talk. Also, when confronted with an ambiguous situation, something like a person who seems uninterested in what you're saying, you are more likely to interpret the situation in a way that is consistent with your anxiety. For example, this person finds me boring, than with a more neutral interpretation, such as, this person seems very distracted. The behavioral component of social anxiety usually involves avoidance of the feared situation. This may include complete avoidance, such as not going to a party, or more subtle forms of avoidance, for example, going to a party but only talking to certain safe people. In addition, social anxiety may be associated with other behaviors, such as checking your appearance in the mirror and constantly trying to figure out whether people are reacting negatively to your behavior. Social anxiety disorder. Social anxiety disorder, also called social phobia, is a term used to describe social anxiety that is extreme enough to greatly bother a person or cause significant interference in the person's life. The criteria that professionals use to define social anxiety disorder include the following. The person experiences an intense fear of one or more social or performance situations in which the person fears that he or she will do something embarrassing or show signs of anxiety. The person becomes very anxious or panicky when exposed to a feared social situation. The person recognizes that the fear is out of proportion to the real danger. The person avoids the situation or endures it with intense discomfort. The social anxiety bothers the person or leads to significant interference in functioning. If the person is under 18 years old, the problem has lasted at least 6 months. The social anxiety is not due to another problem. For example, the person is not avoiding social situations simply because he or she is feeling depressed and is uninterested in socializing. Note that social anxiety disorder may involve many different situations or as few as one situation, for example, public speaking. The main difference between social anxiety disorder and normal levels of social anxiety and shyness are that in social anxiety disorder, the anxiety usually occurs more frequently and more intensely, and the anxiety causes problems for the person by interfering with work, relationships, or other activities. In many cases, a fear of public speaking would not meet criteria for social anxiety disorder, because such fears often don't impact on people's lives in any meaningful way, because many people only rarely have to speak in public. However, for a person who has to make frequent presentations for work, a fear of public speaking may well meet criteria for social anxiety disorder. Recent epidemiological studies have estimated that up to 13% of the general population meets the clinical criteria for social anxiety disorder at some time in their life. In addition, social anxiety disorder is often associated with other problems, including depression, eating disorders, and substance abuse. Fortunately, social anxiety disorder often responds quite well to treatment. We will review the treatment options for this problem later in this chapter. Causes of social anxiety and social anxiety disorder. Social anxiety disorder seems to run in families. People who have an immediate family member with social anxiety disorder are 2 to 3 times more likely to develop social anxiety disorder compared to people without social anxiety disorder in the family. The fact that social anxiety disorder runs in families is probably related to both the genetic heritability of social anxiety as well as the process of learning anxious behaviors from parents or other family members. In fact, evidence is now pointing to the fact that social anxiety disorder probably stems from an interaction of both biological and psychological processes. Biological factors. Twin studies that have attempted to separate out the effects of learning and genetics have yielded inconsistent results, with some studies showing that genetics plays a moderate role in the development of social anxiety disorder, and other studies finding a relatively small genetic contribution. Nevertheless, 2 personality traits that are associated with social anxiety have been shown to be highly heritable. These include neuroticism, a tendency to feel anxious, tense, and worried, as well as to react emotionally to a variety of stresses, and introversion, a tendency to be relatively quiet and socially withdrawn compared to other people. Although research on the biological basis of social anxiety is still in its infancy, we are beginning to learn about the role of the brain in social anxiety. For example, a part of the brain known as the amygdala may be involved in social anxiety, as well as other anxiety-based problems. Studies examining patterns of blood flow in the brain have found that people with elevated levels of social anxiety show more activity in their amygdala, and that treatment with either medication or cognitive behavioral therapy tends to decrease this activity. In addition, there is evidence that certain brain neurotransmitters, in particular serotonin, are involved in social anxiety. Psychological factors. Although a person's biology plays a role in the development and maintenance of social anxiety, psychological factors are also very important. A psychologist by the name of S. Rockman, 1976, identified 3 different pathways to developing fear. Traumatic conditioning, which involves experiencing some negative event that triggers the fear. For example, being teased after a class presentation may induce a fear of public speaking. Observational learning, which involves developing a fear by watching someone else behave fearfully in the situation. For instance, developing social anxiety by growing up in a family of shy parents and siblings. And informational learning, which involves developing a fear by being told that a particular situation is dangerous, such as being told to watch your back when around other people. A number of research studies support the view that these methods of learning can influence the development of social anxiety. Compared to people who are comfortable in social situations, people with social anxiety disorder are more likely to grow up in homes where other family members are socially anxious, an example of observational learning. Parents use shame as a means of discipline, traumatic conditioning. Family members place great importance on the opinions of other people, informational learning. And children are discouraged from socializing, informational learning. In addition, many researchers believe that people's beliefs play an enormous role in whether they feel anxious in social situations. Common beliefs held by people who are socially anxious include, notice that many of these beliefs reflect perfectionistic standards and beliefs. I should not appear anxious in front of other people. I should always appear to be brilliant. I should always be entertaining when I'm talking to other people. It is awful to blush, shake, or sweat in front of others. People can tell when I am anxious. I will not be able to speak if I am too anxious. People will find me unattractive. I will look incompetent if I speak to my boss. People will become angry with me if I make a mistake. Perfectionism and social anxiety. Compared to all other types of anxiety and fear, social anxiety may be the most closely linked to perfectionism. Research from our clinic and elsewhere has found that people who are socially anxious are more likely than other people to be overly concerned about making mistakes, particularly in social situations. For example, they may hold the belief that if they make a mistake or fall short of their standards, they are complete failures. In addition, social anxiety is associated with a tendency to doubt one's abilities in social situations, including one's ability to make a good impression on other people. If you have a tendency to set overly high standards for yourself, it is likely that you will be unable to meet your strict expectations. If you can't accept the possibility of another person finding you boring, unattractive, or incompetent, you put yourself at risk for feeling anxious when interacting with other people who you perceive as threatening. In addition, if your perfectionism causes you to avoid certain social situations, you prevent yourself from ever finding out whether your anxious predictions are correct. Effective treatments for social anxiety. Although professionals may use many different treatments to help people overcome social anxiety, only two main types of strategies have been tested out in controlled research studies. These include medication treatments and a variety of different cognitive and behavioral techniques. In the few studies that have compared these two general approaches, both seem to work equally well in the short term. However, there is evidence that cognitive and behavioral treatments have longer-lasting effects compared to medications once treatment has ended. Studies on combining medications and psychological treatments have generally found little benefit of combined treatments over medication or psychological treatment alone. Cognitive behavioral therapy. Many studies have now established that cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is effective for helping people overcome social anxiety disorder. These treatments include three main approaches: using cognitive techniques to identify and change anxious thoughts and predictions regarding social situations, using behavioral techniques, primarily exposure, to help a person confront feared situations until they are no longer frightening, and using social skills training to teach individuals the skills needed to perform effectively in social situations. Some of the skills that may be taught during social skills training include how to be more assertive, effectively using eye contact and nonverbal communication, and learning to get close to new people. Cognitive and behavioral methods for dealing with perfectionism are described in Chapters 7 and 8 in detail. Treatments using medication. Following is a list of medications that have been shown in controlled studies to be effective for treating social anxiety disorder. Medications for which results have been mixed are not included. We have included both the generic name as well as the brand name for each medication. Generally, the SSRIs and venlafaxine XR are recommended as the first medications to try for social anxiety disorder, based on effectiveness, side effects, and other factors. Medications that have been shown to be effective for social anxiety disorder. Selective serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, SNRIs. Venlafaxine XR. Effexor XR. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRI antidepressants. Citalopram, Celexa. Escitalopram, Lexapro, Cipralex. Fluvoxamine, Luvox. Paroxetine, Paxil. Sertraline, Zoloft. Benzodiazepines, anti-anxiety medications. Clonazepam, Klonopin, Rivotril. Alprazolam, Xanax. Anticonvulsants, gabapentin, Neurontin. Pregabalin, Lyrica. Monoamine oxidase inhibitors, MAOI antidepressants. Phenelzine, Nardil. You may notice that many of the medications that have been shown to be effective for social anxiety disorder are actually antidepressants. Antidepressant drugs appear to be helpful for most types of clinical anxiety, even in people who do not feel depressed. Chapter 10 discusses various issues related to taking antidepressant medications, how to choose from the various options, side effects, and so on. Many of the medication-related issues discussed in Chapter 10 are also relevant to the anti-anxiety medications, for example, clonazepam, alprazolam, although there are a few important differences between antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. First, anti-anxiety medications typically start working within a half hour or so after taking the pill, whereas antidepressants usually take up to 4 weeks before they start having an effect. In addition, the side effects of anti-anxiety medications are typically different than those for antidepressants. For anti-anxiety medications, the most common side effect is fatigue, which usually improves during the course of treatment. Finally, compared to most antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications are often more difficult to stop taking because they tend to be associated with withdrawal symptoms, particularly when stopped too quickly. Withdrawal symptoms typically include symptoms of increased anxiety and arousal, for instance, racing heart and dizziness. These symptoms can be minimized by decreasing the dosage gradually. Changing perfectionistic thoughts and behaviors in social anxiety. In this section, we discuss strategies for challenging anxiety-provoking thoughts and changing anxiety behaviors associated with social anxiety. For a more detailed discussion of strategies for overcoming social anxiety, check out our Shyness and Social Anxiety Workbook. Challenging perfectionistic thoughts. Rather than assuming that your perfectionistic thoughts are true, it is important to treat your beliefs as possibilities or guesses. Unless you are able to accept the possibility that your standards for performance are too high, it will be difficult to shift your expectations to be more realistic. Chapter 7 describes methods of changing your perfectionistic thoughts. Several of these strategies are likely to be helpful for dealing with your anxiety in social situations, including examining the evidence supporting your thoughts, changing perspectives, hypothesis testing, changing social comparison habits, and using coping statements. We suggest that you review the techniques described in Chapter 7 to help replace your anxious thoughts with more realistic thoughts. The following examples illustrate how to replace anxious thoughts with more neutral, realistic thoughts. Example 1. I'm nervous about going to the party. Anxious thought. I really don't want to go to that party tonight. I'm not going to know anyone, and the other guests will think I'm boring. Realistic thought. Because I don't know these people, I don't know how they are going to react to me. Often, I have a better time at parties than I expect to have. Maybe it will be okay. If some people find me boring to talk to, it doesn't mean that everyone will feel that way. Besides, even if people don't enjoy my company at this party, it doesn't mean I'm boring. Sometimes I'm bored when I talk to another person, but it doesn't mean that the person is boring. Example 2. I feel intimidated and nervous while on a date. Anxious thought. I am not smart enough to be dating this person. Realistic thought. I have no idea whether or not I'm smarter than this person. In fact, there are so many different ways that intelligence can be measured. I'm sure there are some areas in which I'm smarter. Even if this person is smarter than me, that doesn't mean I'm not smart. I will always encounter people who are better than me at one thing or another. In fact, in every relationship, one person is usually smarter than the other. Example 3. A coworker comes by my desk to chat, but I have nothing to say. Anxious thought. She's going to think I'm an idiot. She'll see me blushing and think there is something wrong with me. Realistic thought. Even if she notices me blush, that doesn't mean that she'll think I'm strange. I certainly don't care when I notice someone else blushing. My sister blushes all the time, and no one seems to even notice. If I have nothing to say, she may think I'm nervous. But she may not. Instead, she may think that I'm busy or preoccupied. Even if she suspects that I'm a bit nervous, it doesn't mean that she will care a whole lot, and she probably won't think any less of me. Besides, it's not my responsibility to entertain people all the time. It's okay if someone thinks I'm strange once in a while. Example 4. I'm having friends over for dinner. Anxious thought. They will hate my cooking, and the evening will be ruined. Realistic thought. I've cooked for people in the past, and usually people enjoy my cooking. Even if they don't like what I've prepared, it doesn't mean that the evening will be ruined. There are many times that I have had dinner at another person's home and not enjoyed my food. I'm still able to enjoy the evening, and I certainly don't think less of my host if the meal is not to my liking. Changing perfectionistic behaviors. Chapter 8 includes a number of strategies for changing perfectionistic behaviors. In the case of social anxiety, communication training may be a useful method for improving important interpersonal skills. However, the most important strategy for decreasing social anxiety is exposure to feared situations. Repeated exposure to anxiety-provoking social situations will eventually lead to a decrease in anxiety. Exposure practices should be frequent, at least several times per week, and should last long enough to experience a decrease in anxiety or to learn that your feared predictions don't come true. You may need to be creative to come up with appropriate situations in which you can practice. For example, if you are fearful of giving presentations, there are a number of different places where you can conduct exposure exercises. You can join an organization called Toastmasters, which gives members opportunities to improve their public speaking skills. Check out toastmasters.org. Or you can take a public speaking course or an acting class. Another possibility is volunteering to speak about your career in front of a group of students in a high school or college. You can even ask a group of friends or family members to be your audience. If a situation is too frightening, you can begin by conducting role-play simulations. A role-play simulation is essentially a rehearsal exposure in which you practice a social interaction in a safer context rather than in the real situation. For example, if you are frightened of going to a job interview, you can practice simulated interviews with a friend or family member. You can even ask your interviewer to purposely be difficult so that the real interview will seem like a piece of cake in comparison. After practicing in simulated interview situations, you can work your way up to interviewing for jobs that don't interest you especially. These practices will help you be more comfortable in interview situations, so that when the interview for the job you really want comes up, you'll be ready. If you are afraid of drawing attention to yourself, practice doing just that during your exposure practices. For example, if you are anxious about having your hands shake while you are holding a drink or writing, let your hands shake on purpose. Let your glass shake until you spill your water. Or, when you are filling out a comment card in a restaurant, let your hand shake enough that the card is unreadable and has to be rewritten. If you are afraid that other people will see you sweat when you're feeling anxious, purposely wear warm clothes so that you are more likely to perspire. The goal of exposure is to learn that the situations that you fear are not dangerous. Even if someone sees you shake or sweat, there are no long-term consequences. Taking frequent risks in social situations. People who are fearful of social situations often fear rejection from other people. If you are fearful of rejection, one of the best things you can do is take social risks more frequently. You may end up being rejected from time to time, but you will learn not to care about the rejection as much. For example, if you tend to fear rejection when applying for a job or asking someone out on a date, you may find that it takes you months or years to get up the courage to do these things. You may fear that the person you ask out or the employer who reads your application will find you unappealing or unacceptable. When you finally do find the courage to take the risk, you may end up feeling very discouraged if you are rejected. You may take this as evidence that your anxious beliefs were true. The experience may prove that you are not good enough, just as you believed. There is a problem with this logic. The truth is that most dates do not lead to long-term relationships, and most job applications do not lead to jobs. Most people occasionally have the experience of being rejected in social situations such as these. To have the experience of not being rejected, a person has to take risks frequently. For example, if the probability of getting a job is 1 in 20, for every 20 jobs that you apply for, you get one job offer. It will take you years to get an offer if you only apply for a job every few months. On the other hand, if you apply for several jobs per week, it probably won't be long before you have an offer. More frequent social risks will lead to more frequent rejection. However, frequent risks will also lead to things working out from time to time. Remember, if you are looking for a job, you only need one offer. The number of rejections is not important in the long run. The same is true of dating. Therefore, we recommend that you expose yourself to anxiety-provoking social situations as often as possible. It won't always go smoothly. However, over time, the situations will become easier, you will become more skilled at dealing with people in these situations, and your chances of success will increase. Chapter 13. Perfectionism and Worry. Everyone worries from time to time, particularly about events over which they have little control. We all endure daily stresses that affect our jobs, school performance, relationships, and other areas of our lives. In these circumstances, it's common to worry about possible negative outcomes. Just like sadness, anger, and other emotional states, worry is a normal part of life. However, worry can become a problem when it interferes with functioning, for example, making it difficult to concentrate or sleep, causes a lot of distress, or continues even in situations where there is no realistic reason to be worried. This chapter is written primarily for people who find that they worry often, for long periods of time, and with such intensity that they experience problems such as appetite loss, headaches, or sleeplessness as a result. The information here may also be of value to people who find themselves getting overly tense, irritable, and restless when they are faced with real problems to solve. What is worry? Worry involves running over some possible future event in your mind over and over again. Worry is a natural response to feeling anxiety, apprehension, foreboding, or uneasiness. Normally, people worry when there is a reason to be concerned about the outcome of some situation or problem. Most people deal with this sort of worry by assessing the problem they face, getting advice if they need it, and solving the problem if they can. If the problem can't be solved right away, they can usually put the problem out of their minds, at least temporarily, while they go about their business. They may say to themselves, "I will worry about that later. There's nothing I can do about it right now." This type of self-talk can be helpful, and is one strategy that many people use to deal with normal day-to-day worries. Generalized anxiety disorder. Although most people are able to put their worries aside when necessary, some people have difficulty turning their worries off. In a condition called generalized anxiety disorder, GAD, worry is experienced as difficult to control, and it occurs at an intensity and frequency that leads to significant interference in people's lives. Among people with GAD, worry is excessive, unrealistic, or out of proportion to the actual threat. In addition, the worry is present most days and lasts for an extended period of time. In fact, many people with GAD report that their worry has been a problem for as long as they can remember. Along with the worry, people with GAD experience a range of other symptoms, including feeling restless, keyed up, or on edge, being easily fatigued, having difficulty concentrating or having their mind go blank, experiencing irritability, having muscle tension, and experiencing sleep problems, including trouble falling asleep, problems staying asleep, or not feeling rested in the morning. Often, it's the physical complaints, such as insomnia, muscle pain, and headaches, that bring people with GAD to seek help from their doctor or another professional. GAD affects about 5 to 6% of the general population and is slightly more common among women than men. It often has a gradual onset, beginning quite early in life. However, for some people, the problem begins after some significant life stress, such as a death in the family or the loss of a job. The intensity of the worry may fluctuate over time. As you might expect, the worry is often worse during times of stress or when there is some realistic threat. Paradoxically, however, some people with GAD describe themselves as very calm and capable during actual emergencies or when there is a real threat to be confronted. What do people worry about? Most worriers tend to be anxious across different areas of their life, rather than worrying about just one or two topics. In fact, when asked what they worry about, people with GAD often report that they worry about everything. Common worry topics for people who are prone to worry include work or school performance, for example, worries about getting fired, failing exams, and so on. Household chores, for instance, excessive worry about not being able to get everything done. Money and finances, for example, anxiety about going bankrupt or not being able to pay the bills. Health and safety of self, for instance, fear of contracting an illness. Health and safety of family and friends, for example, worry about the children's health. Relationships, for instance, unnecessary anxiety about spouse being unfaithful. Other minor matters, for example, worry about finding a parking spot when driving to work. The nature of worry. We now know that worry is something that people do in order to reduce their anxiety. There is evidence that people worry to distract themselves from physical feelings associated with anxiety, as well as from mental imagery that they find frightening. For instance, the image of one's family dying in a car accident. In fact, a significant number of people who worry excessively believe that worry is a good thing. They may believe that being a worrier prepares them for possible danger, helps them to prevent bad things from happening, and makes them a caring person. Of course, there is no evidence that worry prevents negative events, or that worriers are more caring people than those who don't worry excessively. In addition, research has consistently shown that people who worry excessively pay more attention to threat-related information than people who are less prone to worry. In other words, if you are a worrier, chances are that you frequently look out for possible cues that something is about to go wrong. This tendency to be on guard for threat contributes to other problems that are associated with worry, including difficulty concentrating or thinking clearly, and difficulty falling asleep at night. For a perfectionist, there may be the added demand of having to scan the environment well enough to catch each and every indicator of possible threat or danger. Where does this tendency to always be on guard come from? There is evidence that a history of unpredictable negative events may play a role. Several studies demonstrated that the ability to predict the onset of stressful events affects whether an organism will experience chronic arousal later on. In this series of classic experiments, 2 different groups of sea slugs were exposed to mild electric shocks. In one group, the sea slugs were exposed to shock only when a light was turned on, but not when the light was off. The presence of the light made the shock predictable. In the second group of sea slugs, shocks were administered randomly, regardless of whether the light was on or off. The shock was unpredictable. The purpose of the study was to evaluate the effects of predictable versus unpredictable shock on arousal. After experiencing the predictable shocks, the first group of sea slugs developed a pattern of arousal that was linked to whether the light was on or off. When the light was on, they showed signs of arousal. When the light was off, they were in their normal resting state. In contrast, after only a few shocks, the sea slugs that received unpredictable shocks became aroused constantly, regardless of whether the light was turned on or off. This group also showed measurable nervous system changes. Sea slugs have neurotransmitters too, that were not present in the sea slugs that received predictable shocks. The chronic arousal seen in the unpredictable shock group is analogous to the chronic arousal reported in people suffering from GAD. Muscle tension is an indirect indicator of arousal and is perhaps the most characteristic physical symptom among chronic worriers. Instead of having peaks and valleys of muscle tension, people with GAD have heightened tension that tends to change relatively little over time. The implication of Candel's research for humans is that a history of predictable stressful events may make it easier to turn off worry when the danger or threat has passed. In contrast, for people who experience a series of unpredictable stressful events, there may be increased risk for developing problems with chronic anxiety and worry. Although it may seem like a bit of a leap to generalize from sea slugs to humans, there is also evidence from research on people showing that unpredictable and uncontrollable negative events are a risk factor for developing problems with anxiety. Perfectionism and worry. Frequently, the basis for excessive worry is a need to completely predict and control negative events, combined with a belief that failing to control events will lead to some disaster that might otherwise have been avoided. People who worry excessively also have difficulty tolerating uncertainty. If they don't know exactly what is going to happen in an uncertain situation, they often assume the worst. Because perfectionism is associated with standards and expectations that are impossible to meet, people who are perfectionistic are at risk for having events not turn out as desired. For example, if you believe that everyone should always be 15 minutes early for every appointment, it may be difficult for you to deal with a partner or child who is always running 5 minutes late. The more intolerant you are of lateness, the more likely you are to be disappointed by other people, and the more likely you are to have a perceived reason to worry. Procrastination and worry. Worriers have difficulty sorting out real problems from a background of possible problems that might come along. As a consequence, they may procrastinate and avoid solving problems that arise. It is hard to settle down to sort out one difficulty if you are predicting that there will be other problems that will demand your attention. In fact, you may believe that your attempt to solve one problem will lead to several new problems that will just make things worse. For example, a perfectionistic student may be frightened to ask for help with an assignment, fearing that this request will result in the teacher thinking he or she is lazy or incompetent. The student may therefore avoid working on the assignment completely, and in the end create even more problems as a result. In this example, perfectionistic worry is associated with the belief that it is better to do nothing than to take a risk and fail. Avoidance and procrastination are often reinforced or rewarded, especially in the short term. By avoiding an anxiety-provoking situation, you may temporarily feel relief from not having had to deal with the problem. You may be rewarded further if the person who had asked you to do the job forgets to check that the work was completed or changes his or her mind about needing it done. Nevertheless, despite the short-term benefits, procrastination may well lead to negative consequences down the line. For example, you may be left with having to complete your work in a much shorter time than was originally available and under a lot more pressure. In these circumstances, it is unlikely that you will do your best work, and you will probably feel dissatisfied in the end. The need to feel perfectly in control over the outcome and the tendency to avoid taking certain risks may actually make it harder to do a good job. Overcompensation and worry. Overcompensating involves taking steps above and beyond those that most people might take to prevent some dreaded event from occurring. For example, parents who are constantly worried about the health of their children may insist on checking their child's temperature at the first sign of any physical symptoms, and may even take the child out of school whenever another child in the class is ill. Consider the following case examples. Joan had two female friends who were both diagnosed with breast cancer several years ago. Although both friends were successfully treated for the illness, Joan subsequently developed intense worry about the possibility of developing cancer herself or of a family member becoming seriously ill. She began to ask for constant reassurance from her husband and children. She was married to a physician who initially agreed to examine her and their children as often as Joan requested in an effort to reassure her that they did not have cancer. Eventually, Joan's husband lost patience with her daily requests for reassurance. Her children also refused to answer her continual questions about their health. Joan began to worry that her husband's refusal to examine her was because he had found something wrong with her health and was hiding it from her. Joan avoided seeing her family physician for fear that the doctor might confirm her fear that she was seriously ill. As a result of Joan's constant requests for reassurance, there was considerable strain in the family, and she worried that her husband was losing interest in their marriage. Randall was the father of two daughters in their late teens, both of whom were very successful students. Randall had always worried about how well they did in school and kept very close tabs on their homework. He was also concerned about their safety when they were walking home after school, a total of 2 blocks. When they were accepted into college, they both decided to move to a city on the other side of the country. Randall tried to get a transfer in his company to be near his children, but his wife didn't want to interrupt her career. She also felt that their daughter should have the freedom to spend some time away. When they left home, Randall found he could not stop worrying about their safety and became very distracted at work. He tried to cope with his anxiety by calling his children as many as 3 times a day, though his frequent phone calls irritated his daughters and didn't really help to reduce his anxiety for more than a few minutes. Treatments for worry, GAD, and perfectionism. A number of treatment approaches have been successfully used to treat GAD and excessive worry, including medications, relaxation training, challenging anxiety-provoking thoughts, exposure to feared imagery, preventing safety behaviors, acceptance and mindfulness-based strategies, and problem-solving training. If your perfectionism appears to be related to GAD and excessive worry, you may find these strategies useful. Treatments using medication. The earliest medications shown to be effective for treating GAD were the benzodiazepines, also known as tranquilizers, which are also used sometimes as muscle relaxants or sleep medications. The benzodiazepines include such drugs as diazepam, lorazepam, alprazolam, clonazepam, and others. These drugs work very quickly and tend to be quite effective in the short term. Although some people find that these drugs are useful for long-term treatment, their effectiveness may decrease as time goes on unless the dosage is increased. Increasing the dosage of these medications puts people at risk for marked side effects, including drowsiness. In addition, because the withdrawal symptoms for these drugs can include intense anxiety, many people have difficulty discontinuing benzodiazepines. Today, physicians often avoid prescribing these drugs for more than a few weeks at a time. Another type of anti-anxiety medication is a drug called buspirone. This medication is derived from a completely different family than the older tranquilizers and does not produce drowsiness or dependence. It takes a few weeks to have an effect, and therefore is not used for acute anxiety. It is as effective as the benzodiazepines, and may work better for people who have not previously used traditional anti-anxiety medications. Finally, as is the case for other anxiety problems, antidepressants are an effective treatment for GAD and chronic worry. In fact, they are often the treatment of choice for this problem. People who are anxious are often very sensitive to the side effects of antidepressants and can become very agitated with the first few doses. Therefore, these medications should be started at very small doses, which then are slowly increased. Treatment should continue for at least several months, and there is a strong risk of relapse after stopping the medication. Refer to Chapter 10 for additional information on antidepressant medications. Here is a summary of medications that have been shown to be effective for treating GAD. Medications that have been shown to be effective for generalized anxiety disorder. Selective serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, SNRIs. Venlafaxine XR, Effexor XR. Duloxetine, Cymbalta. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRI antidepressants. Escitalopram, Lexapro, Cipralex. Paroxetine, Paxil. Sertraline, Zoloft. Benzodiazepines and other anti-anxiety medications. Alprazolam, Xanax. Diazepam, Valium. Lorazepam, Ativan. Buspirone, Buspar. Anticonvulsants. Pregabalin, Lyrica. Relaxation training. Chronic worry can be lessened by learning to relax. Several relaxation methods are available. Progressive muscle relaxation involves learning to relax the muscles of the body to decrease feelings of tension, stress, and anxiety. A second method, known as imagery, involves learning to imagine particular scenes that are soothing. Finally, learning to breathe slowly and smoothly can help a person to relax. The main difficulty with relaxation training is that people often forget to practice. Scheduling regular periods to practice at the same time each day will increase the chances of benefiting from this approach. For example, you could try scheduling the practices just before or after other activities that commonly happen throughout your day. For instance, having a drink of water, going to the bathroom, traveling to and from work, and so on. Even taking a few minutes 2 or 3 times a day to breathe slowly from the abdomen is a very useful way of breaking up the seemingly never-ending stream of tension and anxiety. Challenging anxiety-provoking thoughts. One way of combating anxiety is to challenge the thoughts, beliefs, and predictions that contribute to your anxiety. Chapter 7 provides a detailed description of these strategies, and in this section, we describe how to apply these strategies to GAD and excessive worry. Examining the evidence. Worry is usually associated with 2 main types of thoughts. The first type of thought is a tendency to overestimate the probability of some unlikely event. In the case examples we presented earlier in this chapter, Joan overestimated the likelihood of developing a serious illness. Randall overestimated the likelihood of something bad happening to his children. The second common style of thinking involves overestimating just how bad it would be if a negative event were to occur. An example of such a thought is, it would be an absolute disaster if I arrive at the movie theater and there is nowhere to park. In reality, this situation would probably be manageable if it actually occurred. In order to combat negative thinking that contributes to worry, it can be helpful to examine the accuracy of your beliefs. This process involves asking yourself a series of questions that help you to assess the situation in a more realistic way. Following are some anxious thoughts and some questions that you might ask yourself to challenge anxious thoughts. Anxiety-provoking thoughts. I am going to fail the exam. I haven't studied enough for this exam. I don't know the material for this test. If I fail the test, I will never get into graduate school, and I will never amount to anything in life. Questions for examining the evidence. Do I know for sure that I will fail the exam? Have I done well on past exams, even when I thought I would fail? Did I study less than I usually do for similar exams? What is really likely to happen if I fail the exam? Are the results of a single exam likely to have a huge impact on my overall average? Is it possible for a person to fail a single exam and still do well in life? Attempting to answer questions such as these is a powerful method for challenging the perfectionistic beliefs that contribute to your worry. Following is an illustration of how Zach's therapist helped him to use this method for challenging anxious thoughts about money and finances. Zach, I am constantly worried about not having enough money to pay the bills. It drives my wife crazy because I'm always trying to control the way she spends her money. Therapist, specifically, what are you predicting will happen? Zach, I'm afraid that I won't have enough money to pay the rent or to make my car payment. I also worry about my credit card bills getting out of hand. Sometimes I even think that I will go bankrupt. I worry that the whole family will end up living on the street. Therapist, do you have any evidence to support these predictions? Zach, no, not really. In fact, I pay off my credit card balance each month. I'm even 2 payments ahead on my car loan. Therapist, can you think of any evidence that contradicts your worries about money? Zach, to start, I have never been in debt before. Also, I've never missed a bill payment in the past, even though I worry about it all the time. Therapist, what if you were short for several of your bills on a particular month? Zach, that would be terrible. Therapist, what would actually happen? Zach, I imagine that my debts would start to double and triple. I might never get out of debt. Therapist, do you know anyone who once missed a bill payment? Zach, my brother misses payments from time to time. Therapist, what happens when he misses a payment? Zach, nothing seems to happen. He usually just makes it up the next month. Therapist, do you know anyone who has declared bankruptcy? Zach, someone I work with declared bankruptcy about a year ago. Therapist, did this coworker end up living on the street? Zach, no. In fact, she was under much less stress after the bankruptcy than before. I guess even if I had a temporary financial setback, I could manage it. Shifting perspectives. It is often easier to solve another person's worries than your own. Therefore, a helpful strategy for dealing with your own worries is to imagine that you are giving suggestions to a close friend or relative who has similar worries. Consider the following dialogue as an example. Emily, I am terrified to go to sleep at the end of the day. I lie in bed worrying that a stranger is going to come into my home in the middle of the night. It's even worse when my partner and children are away. Therapist, when you get into bed, how likely do you think it is that someone will break into your home? Emily, realistically, I know the chances are low. It's never happened before. But when I'm lying there, trying to fall asleep, it feels much more likely. Maybe 50% likely. Therapist, do you worry that people might break into your friends' and neighbors' homes? Emily, no, not really. It feels like it's more likely to happen in my home, although I know that doesn't make any sense. Therapist, what would you say to neighbors who are fearful of having someone break into their house? Emily, I would probably say that it is unlikely. I would remind them that they have lived there for several years, and there has never been a break-in before. Therapist, can you apply that same logic for your own situation? Tolerating uncertainty and ambiguity. Learning to tolerate uncertainty can combat your tendency to worry about unpredictable and uncontrollable situations. There are many situations that you can't predict or control. Fortunately, however, it's not terribly important that you be able to control most situations. A helpful way of tolerating unpredictable events is to generate a list of possible outcomes and to consider ways of dealing with each outcome. For example, if you are stuck in traffic and are late for a job interview, you have 2 options. You can worry about how terrible it is that you are late, or you can accept the fact that you are late, even though you don't know what the outcome will be. Perhaps the interviewer will be understanding and squeeze you in at a later time. Perhaps the interviewer will reschedule the appointment for another day. Perhaps the interviewer will confront you about being late and send you home without the opportunity to interview again. Regardless of what happens, chances are that the outcome will be manageable. hypothesis testing. If you tend to make unrealistic predictions about negative things that might happen, testing the validity of your predictions using mini experiments can be a helpful way of challenging your anxious thoughts. Before conducting the experiment, make one or more explicit predictions regarding the outcome. Then, conduct the experiment and evaluate the outcome. Did your predictions come true? If so, was it as bad as you expected? For example, if you are worried about an airline losing your luggage on your next trip, check your luggage at the gate and see what happens. If your luggage doesn't get lost, you will have gained valuable information about the likelihood of losing your luggage. If your luggage does get lost, you may learn that the situation is not as bad as you feared it would be. Lost luggage is often found a few hours later. Exposure to feared imagery. As we mentioned earlier, worry is often used as a strategy to avoid experiencing frightening mental imagery. You learned in Chapter 8 that one of the most effective ways of overcoming fear is to expose oneself to feared objects and situations. For example, if you fear heights, your fear will gradually decrease as you begin to spend more time in high places. People who worry excessively often fear experiencing certain images and feelings. Therefore, treatments for GAD have begun to include exposure to these images and feelings as a component of therapy. Imagery exposure involves a few steps. First, it is important to come up with an image that is disturbing to you. For example, if you are anxious about an upcoming exam, you might imagine being in the exam and not knowing the answers to any of the questions. It's helpful to write out an imagery script describing all the details. As you develop your script, be sure to describe the situation in as much detail as possible. Continuing with the example of an upcoming exam, your script might include a description of the room, the color of the exam paper, who else is in the room, where the teacher or professor is standing, and so on. You should include details related to all senses. In addition to describing what you see in the room, your script should include a description of what you hear, smell, and feel. For example, is the room warm or cold? Can you hear the buzz of the lights? Also, be sure to include a description of your own responses in the script, including any thoughts running through your head and any physical feelings you are experiencing in the imagined situation. Often, people read their script into a recorder and then listen to it repeatedly for about 30 minutes per day until it no longer arouses anxiety. A detailed description of how you can use imagery exposure to combat anxiety is described elsewhere. Preventing safety behaviors. Try to write out your worry without engaging in perfectionistic behaviors such as checking or seeking reassurance. As discussed in Chapter 4, these behaviors block you from learning that your anxious thoughts are unrealistic. By preventing these behaviors, you will learn to tolerate uncertainty and imperfection. For more details on prevention of safety behaviors, see Chapter 8. Anthony and Norton also discuss this strategy in more detail. Acceptance and mindfulness-based strategies. As we reviewed in Chapter 9, the more you try to control your anxiety, the worse it's likely to get. Learning to be aware of your experiences without judging them, and learning to accept your thoughts and feelings will likely make it easier to manage your anxiety. Strategies such as mindfulness meditation and those used in acceptance and commitment therapy have been found to be helpful for GAD. Chapter 9 describes these strategies. For an even more detailed description, check out the Mindfulness and Acceptance Workbook for Anxiety. Problem-solving training. In Chapter 11, we discussed how learning to solve problems effectively can help to combat feelings of anger. Problem-solving training is also sometimes useful for dealing with excessive worry and GAD. We recommend that you check out the section on problem-solving in Chapter 11.